They whipped the runaway bride, until a Lakota warrior covered her with his coat. The noon sun burned over Dry Creek like judgment itself, and the sound of leather snapping tore through the silence of the street long before anyone dared to speak. The runaway bride stood barefoot in the dust, wrists tied to the hitching post, her wedding dress torn and gray from travel, hair matted with wind and road grit, eyes wide not from fear but from disbelief that this was what decency looked like. Around her, the townspeople had gathered in a half-circle, faces half curious, half relieved that today the cruelty wasn't theirs to bear. Sheriff Baines held the whip loosely, as if it weighed less than his pride, and beside him the preacher kept nodding slow, muttering something about sin and shame. "She took a man's horse," the sheriff said. "Ran off before the vows were done. What's the law say to that?" No one answered. The only sound was the creak of leather and the hiss of heat on metal. "Then it says she pays," he growled, drawing back the whip. She didn't flinch. Her lips parted, not in prayer, but in something closer to defiance, an exhausted kind of faith that refused to bow. The whip cracked once, and the world stopped breathing. From the far end of the street came the thunder of hooves, heavy, unhurried, the sound of a man who had decided the world was done drawing lines he wouldn't cross. The riders parted instinctively as the Lakota warrior came through the dust, tall, bare-shouldered under a leather vest patterned with white beads, hair bound in 2 long braids, a single eagle feather trembling behind him. His horse was dark and still, its eyes fixed on the woman like it already knew her story. The sheriff lifted his chin. "This ain't your business, Chief." The man dismounted slow, his movements quiet as smoke. "She's bleeding under your God," he said. "That makes her mine." A few men stepped back. The preacher started to protest, but the warrior had already pulled a long brown coat from his saddle. He crossed the distance in 3 steps, his shadow falling over her like an eclipse, and laid the coat across her shoulders before anyone else could move. She blinked once, her breath catching when the fabric touched her skin. It was warm, smelling of cedar and rain, and for a moment the whole town seemed to tilt toward silence. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You're interfering with justice." The warrior looked at him without anger, only pity. "Then your justice is blind and mine can see." His voice carried low, like thunder wrapped in mercy. He cut the rope from her wrists with a single motion, the fibers snapping against the heat. No one stopped him. The whip hung limp in the sheriff's hand, useless now. "She's free," the warrior said. "You got a problem, talk to the wind. It listens better than men like you." He turned then, guiding her gently toward his horse, the coat still around her, and for the first time since morning, she lowered her head not in shame, but in relief. The crowd didn't speak. Even the preacher's words died somewhere between his lips and his pride. When they rode out of town, the dust rose behind them like smoke from a burned lie, and those who had watched were left staring at the empty post where cruelty had been tied too long. The sheriff dropped the whip in the dirt. "World's gone soft," he muttered, but the wind, still heavy with sunlight and dust, whispered back through the street as if correcting him. No, the world had just remembered how to feel. They rode for miles without speaking, the world narrowing to hoofbeats, dust, and the slow rhythm of breath that meant both of them were still alive. The runaway bride held the warrior's coat tight around her shoulders, her fingers clutching the edges like she feared it might vanish with the wind. The land stretched wide around them, endless ochre and bone-white cliffs carved by time, and each gust of dry air carried the smell of sage and rain far away. She didn't know where he was taking her, only that the silence felt different from the one she'd known in town. It wasn't the silence of judgment, but of space large enough to hold her shame without crushing it. When she spoke at last, her voice cracked. "Why did you help me?" He didn't look back. "Because mercy has no borders." She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "They'll come after you." "They always do," he said simply. The wind carried his words away, soft as prayer. The horse climbed a narrow ridge where the valley opened below, sunlight spilling like gold over the far river. "What do they call you?" she asked. "Dakota," he said. "It means friend to all." She almost laughed. "Then today you made an enemy of every man in Dry Creek." He glanced at her, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. Then they weren't men worth keeping. They stopped near a shallow stream, its water cold and clear. He dismounted, helped her down gently, his hands rough but careful, and for a moment she forgot that men could touch without taking. "You need rest," he said, "and a name of your own." She looked at him, startled. "I have one." "You had one," he corrected softly. "But the world that used it tried to break you. You should choose what to be called now." She knelt by the water, seeing her reflection shimmer, a pale ghost in torn white. "Then call me Clara," she whispered. "It was my mother's name. She never looked away from anyone." Dakota nodded. "Then neither will you." The sun dipped low, painting their shadows long across the ground. From somewhere in the distance came a coyote's cry, lonely but proud. "They'll follow your tracks by morning," she said. "Let them," he replied. "The desert keeps what it wants." As night fell, he built a small fire, the smoke rising slow and straight. She sat across from him, watching his hands move with practiced grace. "You could have left me," she said. "Many would have." He looked into the flames. "I've left too many before. Mercy is the only thing that ever found its way back." She fell silent then, listening to the fire's steady breath, the kind that sounded almost human. And when she finally lay down under the coat that smelled of cedar and storm, she whispered the words she hadn't dared to before. "Thank you for seeing me." Dakota stared into the fire, the reflection of her voice flickering across the light, and answered so quietly that only the earth heard him. "You were never invisible." By dawn they were already moving again, the desert still half asleep beneath a sky bruised with purple and gold. Clara rode behind Dakota, her hands resting lightly on his belt, her head bowed against the cold. Every few miles he would glance back to be sure she hadn't fallen asleep, and each time he caught the same steady calm in her face, the kind that looked more like surrender to peace than exhaustion. When they stopped to rest by a line of red rocks, Dakota dismounted and walked a few paces ahead, scanning the horizon. "They're following," he said. "2 riders, maybe 3. Clara's fingers tightened around the coat. "The sheriff? Or men paid to fix pride?" He knelt, touching the ground. "They'll find the prince by sundown." She swallowed hard. "You could leave me. You'd be safer." He shook his head. "Safety's a word for those who haven't lost yet." He turned, his eyes softer now. "And you? Do you still want to run?" She thought for a moment, then said, "I just want to walk without looking back." "Then we climb," he said, pointing to the ridge above them. "It's holy ground. Even cowards fear to follow there." The climb was brutal. Loose stones, biting wind, sun sharp enough to bleed. Dakota guided her carefully, his hand steady on her arm whenever she faltered. Once, when her foot slipped, she caught his wrist, and for a heartbeat neither moved. "You don't let go," he said quietly. "Not of the land, not of mercy." When they reached the top, the world opened wide below them. The desert spread like a red sea, the faint dust trail of their pursuers visible far to the south. Dakota gathered wood from a dead juniper and built a small fire, the smoke rising straight into the sky. "They'll see this," she said. "Good," he answered. "Let them know the trail ends where mercy begins." They sat together as the flames grew, the heat licking color back into her cheeks. "What did you do before?" she asked suddenly. "Before you found me?" He stared into the fire. "I forgot people were worth finding." She smiled faintly. "Then we're both learning again." Below them, thunder rolled across the horizon, though no storm showed, and for a moment it felt like the world was reminding them both that even silence can carry a warning. Dakota looked at her then, the firelight dancing across the scar on his jaw, and said, "If they come by night, we fight by light. And if they don't? Then we still remember why we stayed." She reached for the warmth, her fingers almost brushing his. "You think mercy burns?" she asked. "No," he said. "It survives the ashes." The next day broke in silence, the kind of hush that comes after a storm, but before forgiveness. The fire had died to ashes, the wind carrying faint trails of smoke down the slope, where the river wound like a silver thread through the canyon. Clara stirred awake beneath the coat, her hair tangled, her skin cool from the night air, and for a moment she couldn't tell if she'd dreamed the mercy that saved her. Dakota was already up, crouched near the edge of the ridge, watching the valley. They stopped at the base, he said without turning. 3 men, 1 wagon. The law's not done chasing. She pushed herself upright, her voice barely a whisper. Then we keep moving. Not yet, he said. The land has rules. We listen first. He lifted a handful of dirt, letting it fall through his fingers, eyes narrowing. They'll wait until noon. Men like that always fight in light, never shadow. Clara pulled the coat tighter. You've fought before. Too many times, he said, his tone carrying both weariness and warning, and each one took something worth keeping. He turned then, meeting her sightless eyes. Don't let them take yours. She stood, barefoot in the dust, and said quietly, Then I'll give it freely before they steal it. His jaw tightened, not in anger but in respect. That's not fear talking, he said. No, she replied, it's faith. They broke camp as the sun climbed higher, the ridge glowing red, the heat rising off the stone like breath. When they reached the river below, Dakota knelt to fill the waterskins, his reflection rippling beside hers. If I could see, she murmured, I'd want to know what color mercy is. He smiled faintly. It's whatever color the world takes after someone forgives it. The words hung between them, heavy and light at the same time. Suddenly, the sound of hooves echoed down the canyon, closer now, angry. Dakota's hand went to his knife. They found the trail, he said. Hide here. No, she said firmly. You said mercy doesn't run. He exhaled slowly. Then stay behind me. The riders appeared around the bend. Sheriff Baines first, sweat on his brow, the same whip coiled at his saddle. You made me chase you far, savage, he called. Dakota stepped forward, calm as stone. You chased your own shame, not me, the sheriff sneered. Hand her over, or I take her by law. You had your law yesterday, Dakota said. Today it's hers. Clara stepped out then, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. He gave me sight, she said. What did your law ever give? The sheriff froze, the words cutting cleaner than any blade. For a long breath, no one moved. The river murmured between them, sunlight dancing across its skin. Finally, the sheriff dropped his reins, the whip sliding into the water. You'll both hang for this, he muttered, but his voice had already lost its conviction. Dakota didn't reply. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and sage, and as the riders turned away, Clara whispered, The color of mercy. It's gold, isn't it? He looked toward the sky where the sun struck the river, and for the first time in years, he laughed softly. Today it is. The river had gone quiet by nightfall, carrying only the soft whisper of reeds brushing its surface and the low hum of crickets hidden in the dark. Dakota and Clara sat near the dying fire, their reflections trembling in the shallow water, both too tired to speak and too awake to sleep. The chase was over for now, but peace still felt like something fragile that could break if either of them breathed too loudly. You should rest, he said, his voice low, almost reverent. I'm not afraid anymore, she answered. Fear is just what happens before you're seen. He looked at her across the firelight, the flicker tracing the edges of her face, and for the first time he understood how light could find a way into darkness without destroying it. When I found you, he said, I thought I was saving a stranger. But I think the land was just sending me someone to remind me what mercy costs. She smiled faintly. And what does it cost? Everything that ever made you hard. She leaned closer, the sound of the river wrapping around them. Then maybe I can pay too. They fell quiet again, the flames shrinking to amber glow. Above them, the stars came out one by one, slow as forgiveness. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf called, low and steady, and Clara lifted her head toward the sound. He's not hunting, she said softly. He's mourning. Dakota nodded. That's how the wild prays. The fire crackled, a single spark leaping upward before vanishing into the dark, and she whispered, You think mercy lasts? Only if we let it, he said. She reached across the ashes, her hand finding his. Then promise me you won't let it die. He hesitated, then closed his fingers around hers. Not while I still breathe. The world seemed to settle at that, the night holding its breath as if listening. The river moved again, steady and sure, carrying their reflection downstream where it would shimmer and fade like all things meant to be remembered. and when she finally leaned against him, eyes half closed, he felt the strange stillness that only comes when a man realizes he's no longer running from his own soul. The next morning began red, the kind of dawn that burns everything clean before forgiveness can take hold, and Dakota knew before he even saw them that the law had returned. He had heard the same rhythm of hooves too many times in too many valleys to mistake it for chance. Clara woke to the sound, her hand already gripping the edge of the coat. "How many?" she asked. "5," he said, tightening the strap on his knife. "They've brought a wagon this time. They mean to take you back alive or dead." She stood, shoulders straight, hair loose around her face, blind eyes fixed toward the sound, as if she could see what he already knew, the kind of men who wore justice like armor to hide their fear. "Then we speak first," she said. He wanted to tell her to hide, to stay behind the rocks where mercy might still find her, but something in her voice made him stop. "All right," he said quietly, "but if the law listens only to itself, you stay silent after." The riders came into view, dust swirling around them, rifles gleaming against the rising sun. The sheriff rode in front, his face pale under the brim of his hat, the same whip hanging from his saddle like a snake waiting for its chance. "You got guts bringing her here, savage," he shouted, "but this is government land, not yours." Dakota stepped forward, calm but coiled. "Then maybe your government's smaller than the ground it stands on," the sheriff sneered, spitting into the dirt. "You think you can keep what the law owns?" "I keep what mercy saves," Dakota said, "and mercy doesn't answer to men like you." He motioned to the others, and 2 dismounted, rifles raised. Clara's voice cut through before anyone moved. "You're afraid," she said softly. The sheriff laughed, but his hand trembled. "Of what?" "Of being seen," she replied. "Of finding out your law is just another kind of blindness." Her words hit the air like thunder. For a moment, even the horses stilled. The younger deputy shifted, lowering his rifle slightly. "Sir, she ain't fighting." "No," said Dakota. "She's remembering what the world owes her." The sheriff snarled, snapping the whip. Dakota caught it midair, pulling it from his hand with a single jerk and tossing it into the dust. "That's over," he said. "So's this." He turned his back deliberately, the ultimate insult, and began walking away with Clara beside him. The men didn't follow. The sheriff stood frozen, pride breaking where law couldn't hold it. The wind lifted the whip again, rolling it toward the river where it sank without sound. Clara smiled faintly. "You didn't kill him." "He was already dying," Dakota said, "just not fast enough to know it." They walked until the sun burned high, 2 shadows crossing the desert, one guided by sight, the other by faith, both following the same mercy that had learned to walk without asking permission. By the time the sun began to fall, they had reached the high plain where the grass grew yellow and dry, and the scent of smoke drifted on the wind like a warning. Dakota stopped, scanning the horizon where a thin column of fire rose beyond the ridge. "Not the law," he said quietly. "The fort." Clara turned toward his voice, the fear in her throat barely held back. "Are they burning it?" "No," he said. "They're signaling. The soldiers want the town to finish what they couldn't." She reached for his arm. "Then we go the other way." "There is no other way," he said, eyes tracing the long trail of dust behind them. "They'll push us from both sides." She stood in silence for a long moment, then said, "You once told me mercy has no borders. Maybe we find that edge tonight." He smiled faintly at her courage, the kind that didn't need eyes to see the truth. They moved through the tall grass until they reached an old stone ruin half buried in earth. He led her inside, where the air smelled of rain long gone. "We can hold here," he said. "For how long? Until the world remembers which side it's on." She sat, fingers brushing the cold stone, and whispered, "And if it doesn't? Then mercy will have to teach it again." The night came fast, heavy and full of tension. The fire beyond the ridge glowed brighter, painting the sky in dull orange. Dakota watched from the doorway, every muscle tight, the wind carrying the faint sound of distant drums from the fort. "They're calling the townsmen," he said. "Tomorrow this valley will burn." Clara stood beside him, face lit by the firelight that flickered against her pale skin. "Then tonight we make it remember what mercy looks like," she said. He turned to her, struck by the calm in her tone, by the strange light that made her seem like part of the flame itself. "You'd face them all?" he asked. "I'd face anything that forgot what it means to be human," she answered. He nodded slowly, pulling his knife from his belt and setting it on the ground between them. "No blood unless there's no other way." "Agreed," she said. The firelight pulsed, shadows stretching across the floor like ghosts. "Do you think they'll understand?" she whispered. "Not tonight," he said, "but someday someone will tell this story, and maybe then the fire will burn for warmth instead of power." She smiled, her hand finding his. "Then we've already won." Outside, the wind changed, blowing the smoke east, away from them, carrying with it the scent of cedar and rain. Dakota looked at the horizon and said softly, "The fire's moving. The world might be listening after all." Dawn broke sharp and colorless, the kind of light that shows everything the night tried to hide. The smoke from the fort still hung low over the hills, drifting across the valley like a ghost that had forgotten where to rest. Dakota woke first, every sense alive to the silence that never meant peace. Clara stirred beside him, her face calm despite the storm waiting beyond the ridge. "They're close," he said. "How close?" "Close enough to smell their pride." She rose slowly, pulling the coat around her shoulders. "Then we don't hide. We meet them where the mercy started." He looked at her, the torn dress, the dirt-streaked hair, the calm strength in her voice, and nodded once. "If the law finds us again, it won't be the same story." They stepped out of the ruin and into the cold wind. The desert stretched wide before them, the river glinting faintly to the west. The riders appeared just after sunrise, 20 of them this time, soldiers and townsmen mixed together, faces hard, weapons ready. The sheriff rode in front again, his voice loud and brittle. "You had your warning. This ends today." Dakota stood tall, his shadow cutting across the pale grass. "Then end it," he said, "but don't call it justice." The sheriff sneered. "You think the world's going to change because you threw a coat on some runaway?" "No," said Dakota. "It'll change because she finally believed she was worth saving." The men laughed, a cruel, nervous sound. Clara stepped forward, her blind eyes open toward the noise. "If mercy frightens you, then you're smaller than the law you hide behind." The laughter stopped. Even the horses shifted uneasily. One of the younger soldiers looked down, shame flickering through his face. "She's right," he muttered. The sheriff turned on him. "You forget who you serve?" "I remember too well," the man said, lowering his rifle. The tension cracked like glass. Dakota took a slow breath. "You can still walk away," he told the rest. "No one remembers the men who obeyed cruelty, only the ones who stopped it." The sheriff drew his pistol, fury overtaking pride, but before he could raise it, the sound of thunder rolled from the east. Clouds gathered fast, black and wild, lightning splitting the sky like judgment. The horses reared, the wind howled, and in that chaos no one fired. Clara lifted her face to the wind, her voice barely above a whisper. "The world's watching," she said. Dakota reached for her hand, steady and sure. "Then let it see." Rain crashed down, washing dust and hate alike into the earth. When the storm cleared, the soldiers were gone, their tracks already fading. The sheriff's pistol lay half buried in the mud. Clara smiled faintly, turning toward the warmth rising behind the clouds. "You said mercy has no borders," she murmured. "Looks like the sky agrees." Dakota looked at her, the firelight of dawn reflected in her pale eyes, and said quietly, "The world just learned how to see." The storm passed fast, leaving the valley glistening under a sky washed clean of cruelty. The air smelled of rain and sage, of promises that had survived fire, and as Dakota and Clara stood together near the river's bend, the silence felt like the first breath of a world reborn. The townsmen had scattered back to their lives, their pride drowned somewhere between the law and the thunder, and word of what happened had already begun to drift from mouth to mouth, like rumor turned scripture. "They'll call you outlaw," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Let them," he replied. "Better outlaw than blind." She smiled faintly. "Blindness doesn't mean darkness. Sometimes it means trust." He looked at her then, the wet strands of hair clinging to her face, her skin pale against the sunrise. and said, "Then maybe the world's been blind longer than you ever were." She knelt beside the water, her hand skimming the surface. "The river's higher than yesterday," she said. "It remembers." "So does the land," he said. "It never forgets who bled on it or who healed." Behind them the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of drums from a distant ridge, Apache riders watching from afar, not to threaten but to witness. Dakota lifted his hand in silent greeting, and one answered with a single cry, sharp and proud, echoing across the canyon. "They'll tell your story," he said. "Ours," she corrected. "Mercy doesn't belong to one person." He nodded slowly. The light broke across the wet earth then, gold sliding over the rocks and grass, turning the valley into a mirror of heaven. Clara stood, tilting her face toward the warmth. "I can feel the color," she whispered. "What color is it?" "It's what the world looks like when it forgives itself," he said. She reached for his hand, finding it easily now, fingers steady, sure. "Then maybe that's the only color that matters." He smiled, a quiet sound in his chest, and for the first time in years, the laughter that came wasn't armor, it was peace. The river ran brighter, the wind gentler, and the earth underfoot felt alive again. Above them, a hawk circled, its cry fading into the endless blue. Dakota looked at the horizon where the desert met the sky and whispered, "The world's wide enough for mercy after all." Clara squeezed his hand once, the gold of morning washing over them both, and the valley kept its silence. Not the silence of fear, but of something finally healed. The valley bloomed again within days, wildflowers pressing through the wet soil like small bursts of forgiveness, and the river ran softer, carrying away every sound of hatred the storm had left behind. Dakota stood on the ridge watching the world heal, his eyes following the line of smoke rising from the campfires below. Clara sat near the water, her hair unbound, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the wind moving through the reeds. "It sounds alive again," she said. "It always was," he answered. "We just had to make it remember." She smiled faintly, tilting her face toward the warmth that poured across the hills. "You think they'll come back?" "Maybe," he said, "but not with whips. Men like that don't fight what already forgave them." She stood, feeling the grass under her bare feet. "Then what happens now?" "You live," he said. "And you let mercy find someone else." She turned toward his voice, her eyes open but seeing more than sight could hold. "And you?" "I keep walking till the world's done needing my anger." The sun climbed higher, the air sweet with rain, and the land shimmered gold where light touched it. She reached for him, her hand finding his easily. "If you go, take this," she said, slipping the small leather cord from her wrist. "So you remember where Mercy lived once?" He took it gently, wrapping it around his fingers. "I won't forget," he said. "The world has short memory. I don't." They stood together for a while in the silence that followed, the river humming, the earth breathing slow. Then he turned, heading toward the far ridge where the wind waited. She listened to his steps fade, each one steady, sure, like the heartbeat of something sacred. When he was gone, she lifted her face to the sunlight and whispered, "The blind see first." The breeze caught her words and carried them out across the valley until even the sky seemed to repeat them. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Dakota stopped and smiled, the leather cord warm in his palm, and said softly, "And mercy never leaves." The light deepened around them both, and for the first time, the West felt healed. Would you have stood for mercy when the whole world demanded punishment? If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe to Redemption West, where every silence learns to speak and every story remembers what it means to be human.